NIST CSF 2.0 has landed, and boy has it made a splash. The National Institute of Standards and Technology's flagship framework was released in February of 2024, nearly 6 years after its last update, 1.1. As security leaders, companies, and auditors understand more about the framework, there remains but one question to answer. CSF 2.0, how do you implement it for your organization? If you're trying to find an answer for this question, you're realistically in one of three camps. Maybe you're already CSF 1.1 compliant and you're wondering what additional lift is needed to get you to 2.0. Or you're SOC 2 or ISO 27001 compliant and you'd like to add CSF 2.0 as a feather in your cap. Maybe this is the first time you've ever heard about CSF 2.0 and this is where you want to start your cybersecurity journey. Regardless of where you stand, we'll help you get to where you want to go. And to help us with that, we'll hear from a couple of experts so you get an on-the-ground look into what it takes to implement CSF 2.0. And Steve from Prescient Security and Mackenzie Thomas from Sensor. Here's a quick CSF 2.0 debrief to get us underway. CSF, or Cybersecurity Framework, is at its core a resource that helps organizations of all sizes navigate their cybersecurity efforts. It provides guidance to private, government, and other kinds of organizations on how to understand, assess, prioritize, and communicate their cybersecurity risks. Steve from Prescient can kick us off.
The NIST CSF overall is a risk management framework. It's designed to take standard security processes and align security tools and security processes to standard security processes overall, right? So the idea is to take the families of identify, protect, defend, align those, sort of incident response type, overall phases, and then align your tool sets and your security processes to those things.
The CSF consists of three major components: the CSF core, organizational profiles, and tiers. We made videos about all three, including the brand new govern function in the core of CSF 2.0. So top right corner, if you'd like to learn more about that in detail. From an implementation standpoint, here's what you need to know. Tiers are a way to understand how rigorous your cybersecurity posture needs to be, depending, of course, on your underlying risk as an organization. From tiers, you'll move on to organizational profiles that describe your current and target cybersecurity standing. The CSF core houses the controls that will invariably implement on your way to your target posture. It's important to note that these sections tell you what to do, but they don't prescribe a specific way on how to do that. Let's consider an example. I can tell you that you need to protect your office premises at all points of time. That's an important element of protecting your data. But you don't need to hear from me about where the security cameras need to go, or even what security cameras to use. But CSF 2.0 has taken some steps with the explicit purpose of bridging that knowledge gap. For that, we look at informative references and implementation examples. IR is industry speak for a handbook of sorts to all the other frameworks that use similar controls as the ones dictated in CSF 2.0. Implementation examples contain real-world examples of how to implement the CSF 2.0 controls that you end up choosing. There's also quick start guides and community profiles. Here's Mackenzie from Sensor to explain a little bit more about that.
When looking at, those quick start guides and community profiles, the updated framework kind of anticipated this. And so they're hoping that these organizations are going to come to CSF with varying needs and degrees of experiences for implementing cybersecurity tools. So, new adopters can learn from users' successes and select their topic of interest just from a new set of implementation examples and quick start guides designed for various types of users, kind of how you mentioned, schools and such, or small businesses, enterprise risk managers, just to look to how they can secure supply chains a little bit better too. The real big impact is they've simplified the process to make it more accessible to a wider range of organizations, varying in size and cybersecurity program maturity.
So, how do you get started with implementation? Like we mentioned, there's realistically three camps you're in when you're considering CSF 2.0 implementation. You can use the chapters in the video to skip ahead to whichever is most appropriate for you. Let's start with if you're already CSF 1.1 compliant. CSF 1.1 was a great cybersecurity framework, and if you're compliant with it, you're probably already following the most basic cybersecurity best practices for an organization. So, for you, the question is, what additional lift will you need to get CSF 2.0 compliant? CSF 1.1 was a fairly comprehensive framework, so experts agree that the additional lift for 2.0 won't be large and will mostly depend on your risk profile as a company. Leveraging community profiles here will be super helpful, so you can see what other companies in your sector are doing to bridge this gap. That being said, the biggest change in CSF 2.0 from an implementation standpoint is undoubtedly the new function, govern. While some controls in relation to governance did exist in 1.1, albeit spread across different categories and controls, some of these controls are new and will require an additional lift to prove compliance with. Here's Steve from Present again.
Obviously, there's the new family, right? The governance family, which I think is the most significant change to deal with if you're already compliant. There's some of those elements of governance did exist in the previous versions, and so it's not so much that those are net new controls overall. It's more that they're now organized in a slightly different way. But I think that's the main thing, is to look at those governance controls and say, okay, now that's a distinct category. It's got its own set of controls. Let's look at that and make sure that we're doing that in a good way. Because I think the weakness of something like NIST CSF is there's no specific set standard for what it means to be, quote, compliant with this standard, right? And so you could look at the previous controls and you could say, you know, I meet 9 out of 10 of these controls, so I think I'm compliant for this family. Well, if you left out the governance one, that was part of that family, right? And you said, okay, I'm doing the technical stuff, but I don't have this oversight piece. Now you have to deal with that, right? You have to address that in a more holistic way. So I think that's a good thing that it's now called out as its own separate category. I think that's going to help people be better. You know, that's the big lift at this point, is to say, okay, what were we maybe not doing so much of last time we did this exercise? How do we address governance as this distinct category now, the controls that are part of governance, and make sure that we're really adequately doing these things.
Next up on your journey to CSF 2.0 is if you're already compliant with traditional frameworks like SOC 2 or ISO 27001. Say you're compliant with these. What would your journey to CSF 2.0 look like? One particular emphasis of CSF 2.0 was its acknowledgement that we don't live on compliance islands. Compliance frameworks are built to make sure you're following all the available best practices to protect yourself and your data. And as a result of that, they often have significant overlaps in controls. Let me give you an example. Say you're SOC 2 compliant. You've probably chosen SOC 2 because it was the de facto standard for compliance in North America. However, in getting that SOC 2 attestation, you're also much closer to the de facto international standard, ISO 27001, than you realize. ISO 27001 and SOC 2 share up to 90% of that control, so there's not that much lift needed from having one to getting the other. That being said, if you are SOC 2 or ISO 27001 compliant, there is some notable value in getting CSF 2.0. Here's Steve again.
You know, SOC is an interesting use case here, right? Because the SOC standard was a way of essentially using guiding principles to try to get to an outcome, but the language was very non-specific. The organization implements logical and security access controls to protect its environment according to its objectives. Well, what does that mean? Right? What logical access controls are you talking about here? And so one reason why I think security professionals like the NIST standards is they are much more prescriptive. So when you look at access controls in the NIST family, it's very clear. What do the access control means? It talks about specific password standards. It talks about implementation of MFA and all of these kinds of things. It's really like tightly defined processes and control sets that you should be implementing. And so it takes away a lot of that sort of wishy-washy, well, you can do some of this and some of that, and as long as it meets your objectives, and you're fine. And it puts it into this framework that's much more prescriptive. And the NIST CSF is essentially mapped to all of those standards. When you look at a given control in a CSF, you can see there it's mapped perfectly to the NIST 853. And so it's a very clear mechanism for saying, how am I doing here? When PCI first emerged as a standard, what we saw was there were an awful lot of companies who had PCI certifications who had significant data breaches. Companies were compliant, they were meeting the requirements of the control, but they were still getting breached. And why was that? It was happening because the standard was incomplete. The standard didn't include enough things to manage risk and to manage potential for data breaches. And so NIST is a much broader, much more comprehensive look at organizations' security controls. And so that's, I think, again, why do people like this, right? Because it addresses everything. It addresses all of your major risk areas. It addresses all of your major security control areas. It gives you very specific guidance as to how to do those controls. And if you go in and you do those things and you're implementing those things in a good way, you're going to manage your risk in a really good way.
Finally, let's consider the last step. You're starting your cybersecurity and compliance journey. And CSF 2.0 is your first crack at it. First off, congratulations. You've recognized that risk management is important and you've picked a great starting point for yourself. Let's discuss in detail how to get you started. Here's Mackenzie from Sensebar to kick us off.
My biggest kind of recommendation initially is just get comfortable with the framework. Take a look into these quick start guides and community profiles and just gain a better understanding of what are the goals of your company. What are you trying to achieve with the new CSF 2.0 framework? Next, I would kind of evaluate your company as a whole, look into your cybersecurity posture, risk profile, asset inventories. And this is really just in order to get a strong baseline of, how can your company improve and how prepared is it to evolve with all the kind of demands of cybersecurity.
Even if you're a small organization, there's some existing cybersecurity processes you already probably follow, like updating your software regularly or using secure passwords for your devices. Once you consolidate everything that you're already doing, you'll arrive at your current profile. Depending on your underlying interests, you choose a desired state of cybersecurity for yourself. That will be your target profile. Everything between where you stand and where you want to be will be the things that you need to implement. Steve can tell us a little bit more.
The first step is to just quickly identify what are the controls that we really have today, plug those things into this framework and say, what are we doing and what are we not doing? Now we've got our gaps identified. And then you can start, again, you can drive into those, what would be the best practices for this thing if we're not doing it today? You can use the NIST 853's guidance for that, or you can use other standards as guidance for that, but it's mapped that way so you can get that guidance. So you can say, okay, now what should we be doing here? And then you can start making those business case decisions. Okay, what are the things that could potentially happen to us, right? You go through sort of a risk exercise. What are the threats that could potentially take advantage of this gap? What are the significant problems that could happen if we have a gap like this? And then, what would it cost us to implement this control? You can start doing very realistic thinking about, do I want to do this or not, right? And again, going back to there's no set standard for this. You don't necessarily have to do all the controls in order to say you're compliant with something like NIST CSF. But what you want to do is understand your risk and accept your risk. And that's really the key.
So, where do you want to go from here? Well, if you want to get CSF 2.0 compliant, there's two ways that Sprinto can help. The first is a CSF 2.0 checklist that you can download from the link in the description and the comment section below. This is a great way to get started on your compliance journey. But if you're watching this video, I suspect you're looking for a little bit more. And that brings us to the second way to get help. Compliance automation. Sprinto helps thousands of companies leverage compliance automation across several frameworks, NIST CSF, NIST 853, SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, so that companies can get compliant faster, easier, and more inexpensively. Continuous monitoring via Sprinto's centralized dashboards means that you stay compliant all year round, not just during an audit session. To know more, visit sprinto.com or book a demo with one of our NIST experts using the link in the description below. And as always, if you have any questions, NIST CSF is a new framework, you can leave them in the comment section below. We'll get back to you as soon as possible.